Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Do let me know whether or not there are any audio issues, any video issues, and we will try our best to get around those. Don't seem to, at the moment, have any kind of guests coming on today, but we'll see who pops their head in later. For those of you who are unaware, this is a set of streams that we are doing, moving towards hopefully a comprehensive and useful report on the Grooming Gang's scandal, or as we are preferring to call it nowadays, mass ethnic rape. So, what we've been through so far, this is obviously the third stream, we've been through the Office of the Children's Commissioner's briefing to Michael Gove. We've been through the If Only Someone Had Listened, Child Sexual Exploitation and Grooming Gangs report, and we are currently going through the J report, which is the most famous of these three documents. The J report is basically the Rotherham scandal, and it's been made possible by the actions primarily of Jane Senior, who set up a youth project called Risky Business, which was seemingly the only non-corrupt institution in all of Rotherham when it came to dealing with these sorts of things. We're hopefully going to amass a wealth of information that we can use. We have chronology here. There were 3 operations, which I will need to go into off-air probably. We have the scale of the thing, and again, this is just Rotherham. And last time we went through case studies as well, which can be found in pages 44 to 50. I may come back to those and reuse them as part of the project when it comes to putting it all together into a kind of comprehensive documentary style format. But today I kind of want to get away from the case studies, not just because they are harrowing and they're very difficult to read, but I think we've read enough of them at this point to understand what the general inference is. We know, for instance, that this is not a localized network. This is a national network. We had children who were being moved 300-400 miles away to varying different children's homes, finding themselves new relationships, and then those people trafficking them straight back to the people who were originally abusing them. We've seen elements of the scale of the kinds of violence, the kinds of threat, and we've seen a little bit of the corruption of the institutions. So what we've seen is that these groups called LSCBs, which stands for London Safeguarding Children's Boards, they're multi-agency bodies. So the idea is that it's supposed to be a collaborative kind of board between police, child protective services, social services, and the children's homes themselves. And we know full well that they've failed across the board. 94% of them failed to meet adequate CSE protection requirements. Of course, as well, we know that the government itself has been attempting to obfuscate the kind of scale of the problem, or the type of grooming going on, mainly because we know that where is it here? They're not assessing whether or not they're performative. They know that of the LSCBs, of which there are 146, only 11 of them have a strategy which is woefully underselling the issue. Only 11 of them have this ending gang violence approach. Many of them have no joint or local strategies. And the ones who do consider child sexual exploitation to be a priority are ignoring gangs because whatever reason. We can infer reasons, but there's no concrete reason yet. We know that the ones who are committed to ending gang violence, which is only 11 of this 146, and of that only 9 are collecting prevalence data. So how widespread is the issue? The others are dealing with it on a day-to-day, case-by-case basis and are not collecting the information on how much of a problem it is in their area. including, 41% of the 51 LSCBs who have identified a problem with child sexual exploitation. Nearly half of them don't include gangs at all. 31% of them don't include gangs or groups in this profile. So that's the general gist of that. This report was also misleading because it refused to collect demographic data, or rather, it collected ethnic data, but it didn't provide it didn't provide a numbers breakdown. Basically, it didn't show us how many people in each category were being abused and by whom and where and why. And so they concluded from this second report even that, oh well, grooming and sexual exploitation can happen to anyone, which everybody already knows. It's not exclusive to any one particular race. What we do know is that it is basically massively overrepresented in one area against one group of people, which is something that this report did not explore. So there is that. But yes, last time we got to page 50 of the J report. So we're going to go through the rest of it now. Potentially at some speed, but it depends how interesting and relevant it is, and how much obfuscation there is from general government speak, managerial nonsense, and so on. We also have another 180 something sources to go through, and someone has very recently linked me to a web crawler that they've done up for this very project, and that's identified another 350 articles. So I may end up having to go through a lot of this in my spare time off air. But things are looking promising. It's hopefully going to go well. I'm also hoping that we'll address today the issues of John Wedger and Sarah Champion. John Wedger is a former police officer who's making claims that he was shut down at every turn when it came to child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, that he was finding victims all over the place, and no one was doing anything, and he was told he was to be shut down. Now, he's come under scrutiny because aspects of one of the cases that he brought up in an inquiry don't seem to match up with reality. So hopefully I will be approaching him, but we'll look at his report. I'll be asking to see if he can corroborate any of the information he's given in that. He mentioned several times in this UK government's cover-up of grooming gangs, ITNJ Judicial Commission inquiry into human trafficking and child sex abuse. He mentions that he has received correspondence from several bodies which claimed that they would get back to him and never did. And one which I'm particularly interested in, where they claim they responded to him and said, well, actually we did receive your request, but we've lost it and all of the information associated with it. So I'm hoping that we can corroborate at least some of what he's saying, because he seems to be well-meaning, unlike some people who have mischaracterized him at the moment as money grabbing, although his 8,000 odd Twitter followers don't lend me to the idea that he's doing this for the money, right? Especially not with 4 kids. Right, let me just check everything. Hello to everyone in the chat. Hello, Autojarth, nice to see you. Billy Blogs, Immaterial, Micah Bickney, British Knight, Spoons and Forks, and Emrula Sinur. I clearly mispronounced that last name, but there we go. It's nice to have you here. It's always good to have the company for these sorts of things, and to appreciate it. As always, if you wish to submit more resources for us to go through, please feel free to either send it to me directly on Twitter, to send out a tweet with hashtag #atrocityproject, same as in the title of this stream. You can also go onto my Discord, which, if it's not linked in the description of this video, will be on a Fake Accents Unite video, and there's a channel in there for Atrocity Project materials. Additionally, we can, if you wish to support the project or the channel in any way, then there's the usual ways of doing that through, Patreon, Streamlabs, and Super Chat. But don't feel obligated at all. This is off my own back, and I really don't want to be mischaracterize myself as someone who's just doing this for a quick pound or anything like that. So please only give if you feel that you are compelled to, rather than pressured by me. All right, let's get to the J report, page 51. This is a section on children and young people's services. So hopefully a bit more about the government side. We've heard a lot about the victims so far, but really interested, and a little bit about risky business and a little bit about the police. But I'm really hoping that this section will cast some light on what was going on in the social services side of things. So there was evidence of a good level of engagement with individual children, both by risky business. Unsurprising, they seem to be fairly solid. Again, hoping to get in contact with the people who were involved in that, and more recently by members of the CSE team. Children and their parents were consulted and kept informed. There was good access to services provided by risky business. With the integration of that project into the CSE team, the capacity to provide open access was diminished. Now that's an interesting development there. We can't draw any conclusions particularly, but it means that they're less transparent, which is a shame. Several people expressed regret about this to the inquiry. Good. Thresholds for social care had been in the past unacceptably high. While this had improved through the efforts of the co-located CSE team, there are currently insufficient resources to meet all the demands. Risky business made referrals to social care, children's social care, in their but in the early years, the response was rarely good enough. At that time, there was a lack of clarity in interagency meetings discussing individuals, no clear direction provided by senior managers. In historic cases, assessment and care planning by children's social care tended to be more systematic and of a higher standard for looked after children than for other children. Yes, if the children were classified as problem children, we know that they were the ones most at risk. The quality of response by children's social care is better now than it was, but that doesn't tell us how good it is. Better and doesn't tell us how good it is now. There are weaknesses in risk assessment and risk management which need to be addressed with some urgency. Again, remember this is 2013 that this is coming up, and we know full well that there were 19,000 victims last year reported. So something is off here anyway. Sorry, I had a rough night, so a lot of water, I think. Many of the current sexual exploitation cases are complex and time-consuming, with risk of overstretch. Preventative work with children is being squeezed. That's a very technical term there. There's been a rise in online grooming and exploitation. This is placing new and challenging demands on services. Again, it's hard to tell how much of this is incompetence and how much of it is due to the fact that the government services are a behemoth and move very slowly in response to things. In the past, local residential units were targeted by perpetrators of sexual exploitation and were overwhelmed by the problem. Let me just... I'm going to pop out chat on the side so I can see what people's comments are as they go along. How can I trust the police after this? I don't particularly trust the police, Andrew. I am pretty much... Muck is good to mention Janaya, actually. She came up shortly after the Count Dankula case in 2016, 2017 even, and 2018. So, yeah, she's a good resource there. I'm not expecting to trust the police. I'm pretty quiet. I can turn myself up a little bit if people have a problem with that. Oh, I think it's because I changed my microphone. Hopefully, I've adjusted the noise profile so there shouldn't be a buzz on it anymore. Let's see what we've got. Right. Many of the current... you've already read that. In the past, local residential units were targeted by perpetrators of sexual exploitation and were overwhelmed by the problem. Some children placed out of area for their own protection were failed by services. That's the case where they basically say, go away, you're too much of a problem for us, your groomers are all here, and then they realise that where they're sending them, there's a whole load of groomers. High priority should be given to adopting a more strategic approach to out-of-authority placements and improving the quality of response to this group. Yes, it's very nice of them to say that, but whether or not it gets enacted is another thing. Oh yes, they've got to do the shit sandwich thing. There are some excellent services in Rotherham, including the Bridges Project for care leavers, blah 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 blah. Even today there is little, if any, post-abuse counselling. Yes, this is where we saw that, where is it? Something about PTSD in here. If I can find PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It was something like, where are you? Yes, over a third of children developed and exhibited mental health issues arising from their abuse, and that's all PTSD-wise. And a massive preponderance of those 1/3 of cases were the 20% of abused kids who had gone into an area where they were then re-abused. Yeah. All right. Let's go back here. There is a major gap given the long-term damage caused by sexual exploitation. Of course, it's much like it's a parallel, interestingly, with the way they used to approach the military even as little as 2 years ago, where you would be given veteran service and that would persist with you for I think a year, maybe 2 years after you left the forces, and then after that they just let you go. There's nothing more. There's no mandatory exit interview either, so they're not very good at determining why you left. Well. Nearly exploded all over myself, and you get to catch that on camera. Lovely. Yes. I had a tea towel around somewhere, but oh well. Right, there's evidence of agencies engaging positively with children and young children, both historically through risky business and currently. So again, more that says only risky business was the decent one, and the CSE team that's current is the one which has had risky business folded into it. In 81% of the cases that we scrutinised, don't notice that they don't give a number for how many cases they actually scrutinised, but children were seen on their own at key stages of assessment, care planning and delivery, and they or their parents were consulted and kept informed. There was evidence of services actively seeking to take the child's view into account in 79% of cases. Still not enough, but better than none, right? And again, this is something which can be attributed to risky business almost exclusively. Almost exclusively. Risky business, of course, may have been folded in so that they have more control over it because it was seen as doing too much good work. Children's Social Care used a child-friendly workbook entitled Relationships and Staying Safe to help children and their workers, to discuss some of the complex issues around relationships and CSE. This was originally developed by Risky Business, and completed workbooks were in some of the files that we read. They were an excellent and practical example of engagement. Some people might be saying, well, why are they focusing on the kids? Well, a lot of these children believe that the abusers were their boyfriends. So this is a clear case where I can see it being necessary to help educate people. Was I in the army? No, I was in the Royal Air Force. Thank you. Right. Historically, access to children's... where is this? Access to services. Right. So, access to risky business was good. The project received referrals from the police, children's social care, schools, health workers. Parents and children were often self-referred to the project. For example, over the 18-month period, January 04 to June 05, 35% of referrals were from children's social care, 20% were self-referred, 9 from the police, 7 from schools. This fluctuated from year to year. Sometimes the police were the main source of referrals, and at other times schools. Historically, access was much more problematic, in part because risky business was viewed as the main service for children being exploited, and the result being that children and young people were often signposted to risky business at initial contact, rather than being routed through strategy meetings and S47 inquiries. Now, what's an S47? Section 47 of the Children's Act 1989 places a duty on LAs, whatever an LA is, to investigate and make inquiries into the circumstances of children considered to be at risk of significant harm, and where these inquiries indicate the need to decide what action, if any, might be needed to be taken. Right, so let's just process that. Children and young people are often signposted to risky business when they were initially contacted by perpetrators, rather than being routed through strategy meetings and inquiries. Although that's possibly what has saved many of these children, although it's unclear whether or not risky business, when we come to look at risky business in more detail, hopefully through an interview, this paragraph will come in very handy, actually. So I'm going to just copy this across to findings. Again, you can find this atrocity findings document in the description. But I'm just going to make a note here. Useful for risky business. Inquiry. Interview. Right. Voila. Oh, LA local authority. Thank you very much. Of course, I should have known that. Yes. Inspection reports described how over many years children's social services were typically understaffed and overstretched. Yep, they refused to assign resources. There was evidence in many files that prior to 2007, child victims from around the age of 11 upwards were not seen to be a priority, even when they were being abused and exploited sexually. The emphasis on the protection of very young children to the exclusion of CSE victims has been identified in other reports, including the Rochdale Serious Case Reviews, as a national trend rather than a Rotherham-specific issue. Now that's, again, a good finding there. I'm just going to put that in quotes, because I can take that as a direct quote. Nevertheless, this lack of priority resulted in many Rotherham children failing to get help and protection. The outreach nature of risky business meant that CSE was visible as a problem from the late 90s. In 1997, in fact, the CSE team has some capacity to provide outreach, and this is of a high standard. Members of the team confirmed that at the present time there is no proactive service accessible that had the capacity to reach out to children who are being exploited but not yet in contact with the services. Again, this was the trend. The reason it has been has grown to such a massive proportion as well is nobody trusts the services. The people who did reach out to the services were failed, so nobody goes to the services anymore. With, of course, the exception of risky business. We were told by the Executive Director of Strategic Services that the Integrated Youth Support Service, that's a mouthful, provided outreach support to vulnerable young people who had been exploited. However, youth workers told us that the preventative work they carried out with vulnerable groups of male and female teenagers, including those from minority ethnic communities, was no longer offered because of cuts. Work was in progress for the Integrated Youth Support Service to have a greater involvement with the CSE team in order to improve access to sexual health services, for instance. All right. The inquiry concluded that an important dimension of the services offered in the past by risky business had been reduced or possibly lost. So what I'm hearing from this is risky business was folded into the broader child sexual exploitation team, which led to a reduction in the quality and provision of services. And that's page, I'm just going to go, that's page 53, 6.9. 53. Accessibility was one of the key elements in reaching out to children who have been sexually exploited or groomed, and this needed to be done in ways that young people engage with and trust. Every effort should be made to increase its capacity, blah blah blah. Sexual exploitation tends to be a hidden problem, unless they are literally lining up down the street and you can tell which house the raping is going on in because everyone is calling everyone around them. Which we have heard cases of. The inquiry over the years, assessment and care planning attracted negative comment in many of the inspections of Rotherham Children's Social Care. The figures given in this chapter cover historic social care, risky business and currently open cases. We comment on the current position where it differs significantly from the overall. Again, risky business, good risky business. Assessment and care planning was systematic if a child was looked after. In historic cases, the quality of assessment and care planning for looked after children was markedly better than for other children, where assessments were often weak, unsatisfactory, or missing from files. It was commonplace to find no care plan if children were not looked after, or subject to child protection procedures. Chronologies were only evident as part of the preparation for court proceedings. Again, good to know. There was chronology in fewer than half the cases where it would have been appropriate to have one. Most chronologies were out of date and with significant gaps. Lovely. Again, it's lovely in the sense of this is going to be useful information, not lovely in what it is. There was an assessment on file in 73% of cases, but only for 44 participants. The timing of the most recent assessment was in keeping with the needs of the child in 34 cases. There was an assessment on file in all of the 23 currently open cases that we read. Now, I'm assuming it's hard to tell because there was a chronology in fewer than half the cases where it would have been appropriate to have one. Now, insofar as I remember from last time, there were 1,400 victims between 1997 and 2013. Of these 1,400 victims that were on record, is that what they are referring to? Because in that case, where is it here? We are looking at something like 500-600 kids who should have had a chronology. There was an assessment on file in 73% of these 44 cases. Again, I'm just going to scroll to the bottom because the 11. The number of cases where it was possible to give a rating, which means that out of those 1,400 cases, only 44 is 73%, right? So 44 divided by 0.73, so about 60 cases. So out of those 1,400 cases, only 60 were accessible, or did they only look at 60? That's what I want to know. If we can't trust the police, how long before something super bad happens if something like this happened again? I hate to tell you this, Andrew, but it is ongoing. It has not been dealt with. None of the people who are responsible for the gross negligence or complicity have been brought to account as far as I'm aware. And we are only, I think it's something like 400, just under 400 paedophiles who've been convicted or are undergoing court trials at this time. So what we end up with is noting that in several of these cases there are potentially 300-400 men who are responsible for raping one child. So that's 400 cases nationwide, not just Rotherham. So unfortunately, it's still going on. Muck. Let me see. Oh, if it's been ingrained into the system, is there any hope for the nation, or is the future going to be really dark? The present is dark. The future is bright in the sense that hopefully we're going to shed some light on some of this stuff, and hopefully we can get some traction somewhere and something starts to happen. The biggest thing that I've noticed is that even where there have been appropriate investigations, where there have been whistleblowers and that sort of thing, they appear to be being shut down, minimised, and their voices marginalised as much as possible. Until recently, I was not aware of people like Jane Senior, like John Wedger. The biggest voices that have been amplified would have to be people like Tommy Robinson and, to a lesser extent, Jada Franson, both of whom have only entered the media because they behave badly, right? So, because they're either, in Tommy Robinson's case, he's laddish, and has been very inflammatory, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. And because Jada Franson decided that she would go down and hurl abuse at people in their homes, and unfortunately targeted a couple of people who didn't end up being paedophiles, and so she went to prison, I think it was. Then there's been an issue there. But it's all these other people who it's unclear, and there seems to be a kind of atmosphere of fear around coming out about this stuff, either due to a fear that the people who are running this sort of thing, the people who are allowing it to happen, the people who are being willfully ignorant in terms of their policy to deal with it, are in positions very high up in the police and social services now, and people fear for their jobs, whether or not there are people who are worried because they were either unaware or they were aware and complicit in this stuff for many years, and if they come forward, then they're effectively admitting their guilt, and they don't want to do that because they've either got nice lives or they just want to preserve what life they have. So again, hopefully we should try and be getting some more. Once we've gone through the preponderance of evidence that we have here, the kind of government reports, we'll move on to more fringe stuff. So the whistleblowers. Sarah Champion MP actually is she was the Labour MP for Rotherham, and I can't remember if she resigned because of this scandal or whether or not she had to comment on it, and she was freaking out a bit because she said that she was getting, I think it was either 10 people a day or at least 10 people a week who were coming to her because no one wanted to go to social services or the police. And they were coming to her and they were saying that my child's been abused, you need to do something about this, it's ongoing. And she is the person who quite famously said that she reckoned there were 1 million victims nationwide. And hopefully we're going to try and put a bit paid to that claim. So that's the idea. Abacus. Hey, if you needed someone to help with infographics, some sort of artistry to help put this stuff in the light, I could try to help. I would very much appreciate that. When it comes time to it, we're probably a couple of months off that. At some point I want to put together a trailer, but not until we've got some unique information. Just going through these reports is not enough. We're going to need to do some digging. We're going to need to do some interviews. We're going to need to basically put something together, as I said at the beginning, comprehensively. So that's good. That's the idea. Right, back to this then. So we were looking at these cases. They examined some cases. Again, I don't know why they haven't got an N equals here. For those of you who don't know, N equals basically just means the number of participants in a research sense, or the number of cases. So it's just science speak. Yes, right. The timing of the most recent assessment was in keeping with the needs of the child in over 71% of cases. There was an assessment on file for all current cases. The overall quality of assessments was good or very good in just 2/3, adequate in 20%, and weak or unsatisfactory in 15%. The quality of assessments in open cases was good or very good in 76% of cases and adequate in the remaining 24% for open cases. So what they're trying to say here is that they used to be really bad at keeping assessments, and now everyone gets an assessment, and most of them are good, and none of them are poor anymore. At least they're adequate. There was a care plan on file in 40 cases, 80% for open cases, which is a 20% increase. There was evidence that the services and care received by the young person followed the content of the care plan in over 90% of cases. Okay, good. Where there was a care plan, it mostly set out the desired outcomes for the child or young person in 3/4, and there were SMART objectives. So that's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-oriented or time-related objectives in 3/4 of care plans again. In some of the current and recently closed cases that we read, there seemed to be a presumption that short-term intervention was an appropriate response. For example, some children were offered attendance at 1 or 2 group sessions designed to raise awareness of CSE. However, once there is evidence that a child has been sexually exploited, the presumption is that the child and his or her family need to receive sustained support and safeguarding over a considerable period of time to make sure the child is protected, of course. So again, this seems to be like it's saying the right words, but whether or not it has been implemented is another thing entirely, and I'm certainly not convinced that that's the case. We noted that in the final quarter of 2013, a third of the CSE team's cases had been closed. There was a high turnover of cases in a short period, and this required further management investigation. We read 7 of these cases, judged that several of them were closed prematurely, without all the risks being addressed equally, adequately even. So again, I'm just going to pop that into findings. Let's pop that in there. Dominic, the number of people who were responsible who have still not been held to account and have in fact been rewarded is absolutely sickening. I agree. Which is why, hopefully, even if it's a potential risk to ourselves or myself, we're going to go digging. I'm just pouring myself another lemonade. Right. We met children's social care staff and police officers in the joint CSE team. They were child-focused, enthusiastic, clearly committed to the safeguarding of exploited and at-risk children. They described the pressures and stresses of dealing with CSE. They told us they did not feel under pressure to close individual cases. Nevertheless, they acknowledged that the level of ongoing preventative work they were able to offer children once the immediate risk had been addressed was far less than they would wish. Managers need to give further attention to making sure there is an appropriate level of resources, blah, blah, blah. I'm just having a look-see. I don't want to end up reading, because we're only 5 pages in, right? And it's been 40 minutes, so it's not that I want to minimise the effects of any of these reports, but when they're talking about, this should happen, I don't think that's particularly important for us now. It may come onto it when we look at... We may have to just come back to it when we look at what has been done over the past 7 years. The inquiry considers it imperative that issues around the remit, management and workload of the CSE team are properly addressed. Risky Business used a standard reporting format, the only one which did. These were not available in all cases, but the risk forms were acceptable. Risks associated with CSE were not well understood or responded to. It improved after 2007, but prior to 2007 it was exceptional to find risk assessments. Make sure I pull data from all sides of this. What do you mean, Michael Kelly? I'm trying to pull data from everywhere that I can. Not just the government reports. Yes. Just reading here. Minutes used to be stored centrally and were not recorded on the social care file. This was seriously flawed, and they changed it in 2012. The CSE, or Sexual Exploitation Forum, I should say, started meeting around 2003, late 2003, and discussed individuals up until 2007, but there was no record of these discussions and decisions on children's files. Frontline workers and managers responsible for the case would not have been present at such meetings, leading to a confusion between strategic responses to sexual exploitation and risk assessment and management in individual cases. Right, again, poor interagency communication. Sorry, just double checking no one wants to come on. There was a risk assessment on file in many cases. They seem to be unsatisfactory. So, overall, the quality of risk assessments was only good or very good in a third of cases. They were weak or unsatisfactory in 47% of cases. When examining current cases, there was a risk assessment on file in 59% of the sample. The proportion of missing assessments was unacceptably high, and again 54% were unsatisfactory. Again, useful. When we look at the extent to which, it's just disgusting. It tells me that they're either deliberately mismanaging, disappearing files. You wonder what's on the files which go missing, actually. One presumes that if it's not just gross negligence, the assessments that go missing are the ones which are the most damaging and the most damning. When we look at the extent to which risk had been identified, the results were more encouraging, 75%. Were judged to be adequate or better in open cases. Work was already in progress to improve the quality and consistency. We raised concerns with senior managers about 2 open and 2 historic cases where we considered the quality of risk management and decision making to have been extremely poor. In one of the historic cases, a disclosure made by the child 5 years ago was in the file but was not actioned or reported to the police. So that will be just negligence again and again. We also reviewed 2 historic and 3 open cases with a specialist team from the National Working Group Network. There was a clear consensus between the inquiry file reader and the National Working Group Network that the risk was considerably higher than what was suggested and recorded on file. So we know if we go here, which is what I would say, basically risks were consistently under, what's the word, like it's under risked, it's undervalued, it's under, what's the word I'm looking for? It's underestimated in both historic and currently open cases. 2013. No, Sea Dog. Nice to see you, man. How's Moscow? Or are you not there yet? We read several open cases where children were looked after out of area, one of which was reviewed in detail with a team from the National Working Group Network. We recommended to senior managers there should be an externally facilitated review of one of these cases. Learning, more conclusions. High priority should be given to making sure there is always a risk assessment. Yeah. The manager of the CSE team said that they were struggling to use the risk assessment tool because it only recorded risks where there was hard evidence. This meant that children they considered to be at risk had scores that were too low. Tools that the risk assessment tools that were utilised by the CSE team were only accounted for risks with hard evidence, leaving many children behind or under or underserved. Gathering information in CSE cases is difficult. Children may not see themselves as victims and reluctant to disclose. There is denial on the part of the parents. A lack of hard evidence should not equate to an assumption of no or low risk. We discussed the risk assessment tool with representatives of the police and children's social care. Managers were clear that the numeric scoring system was an aid but did not replace professional judgments. This is clearly stated in recently approved operational procedure. We were told that work had been undertaken on the risk assessment tool to try and address the disparity. Some very good work was in progress to improve the management of high-risk cases. Recently approved for operational protocol. Now allow children to attend their meetings, gap meetings. Who's that? There we go. We refer to quality insurance and continuous improvement, blah, blah, blah. From the mid-90s, there were concerns about children's homes being targeted for CSE. From the residential files we read, it is clear for long periods thereafter, local residential units were overwhelmed by the problem of CSE. Children who were exploited before they became looked after continued to be exploited, were often at even greater risk of harm. Other children became exposed to sexual exploitation for the first time whilst they were looked after in children's homes. They were examples of an exploited child acting as the conduit for perpetrators to gain access to other looked after children. Again, we saw on page 47, I think, the case where the child was describing that they would attempt to get other girls to come along with them because they knew that if there were the more girls there were, the worse, the less bad the raping would be. And they felt guilty about it, but they did what they had to survive. If it's a case of being raped by 5 men and being raped by 25. This happened in local residential units as well as in out-of-area placements, and it appears to have occurred in one of the current cases we read. There was no appropriate management response to the problem of children being exposed to exploitation whilst in care of the council, nor did we find that elected members, as corporate parents, were advised of the scale or gravity of the problem. Damning, isn't it? Right. Afternoon pleb enforcement. There we go. And Carsoni, thank you very much. These streams will hopefully be a collation so that even if something happens to either these documents or to me or to anything else, then these might be saved. That's the idea anyway. Historically, information about looked after children affected by CSE is patchy, because there was no consistent standardisation, as we've noted before. There is not yet a well-developed system for tracking the impact of CSE on children. One reason for this may be that operational managers believe that CSE should be managed through looked-after children processes, so they expected the homes to do all the work for them. In July 2005, 90 children were discussed at the Sexual Exploitation Forum. Management decision was taken to remove from the list all the children who were looked after or on the Child Protection Register. A standard letter was sent to their social workers, reminding them to consider sexual exploitation in future work with the child. With hindsight, this was a serious error of judgment, you don't say. Services for looked after children were stretched and practice was uneven. It was unlikely that frontline staff had the knowledge or skill to deal with organised CSE. Again, organised. This is the thing, it was like a military operation. It also made it impossible to gauge the nature and scale of the problem, particularly for residential units. One response then and now was to place children in residential units outside of Rotherham in the hope that this would reduce the risk of harm from sexual exploitation. We read some cases where this has been successful for particular children. There are examples of children being placed in secure care as the last and only option to protect them from perpetrators. And in several cases, such a placement was beneficial and created the opportunity to work therapeutically with them. There are also examples of out-of-area foster placements being very positive. However, there were many examples of out-of-area residential placements increasing the risks to exploited children and an escalation of missing episodes as they attempted to return home, sometimes to their abusers. Again, they used to, as we saw in some of the case studies, they wouldn't tell you. The children didn't trust the carers. They would consistently be bundled off from home to home, passed from hand to hand. They had no consistency. They had no one who they could trust, with the exception of potentially some people who were engaged with risky business. But the ones who didn't get referred to risky business, who were all victims, made their way to their abusers as the ones who looked after them. And they would attempt to come home if they were moved far, far away. Really, really rough. In July 2014, there were 16 children who were looked after on account of CSE. 6 were in out-of-area placements, 1 in secure care, another waiting for it. There were 3 in out-of-area foster placements and 3 in-house local foster placements. 1 of the 16 children was at home, and another in an in-house residential placement, which just says that it's inconsistent where they end up. A strategic approach to protecting looked after children who have been and are sexually exploited or at risk should now be addressed as a matter of urgency by the CSE subgroup. Of course, it should identify blah 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 blah, but we'll see. It is not an issue that Rotherham can deal with on its own. Cross-boundary solutions must be found. Children who are exploited are routinely being placed in out-of-area placements across the country. Unless councils develop sound strategic agreements with other authorities, these children continue to be exploited and abused and become the conduit for perpetrators to gain access to other children in the same placements. So what ends up happening in general, the child is in one place, they are being sexually abused, they are being failed by the services which are being provided to them. The child is then handed off to another home 300-400 miles away, at which point one of several things happens. They either are there, where they are then brought into a new group of abusers who have also probably got contacts with the other abusers that in the previous place, and they may end up being trafficked back there anyway. They may believe that they have not been abused, they are confused, they don't understand, they've lost all their friends, they've lost all their family and any knowledge of where they are, and they attempt to come home. And in very few cases, it seems, these children are helped by these placements, and only then in secure placements, which is where they're basically under lock and key. Hello, Mira J. Hello out there, all you lovely people, but not necessarily a happy and healthy topic, but we'll see. Is this not dealt with at a county level? No. So, more than happy to talk to you in more depth about everything we found so far, Sea Dog, but if you are interested, the previous two streams go over some stuff in more detail. I appreciate that they're very long, but they're worth a watch. It being dealt with at county level, no. So the consistency that we found was that everything came under the purview of LSCBs, and there was very little prior to really the end of the 90s. There was very little cross, in fact until 2010 actually, there was very little cross-organisational work. This report, if only someone had listened, which is linked in a document which I have linked to in the description, goes through how things were classified. So these London Safeguarding Children's Boards, which existed in 146, was it 146? Yeah, 146 areas, and they failed as recently as 2012 to identify prevalence. They were indecisive and ineffective. There was no coordinated or standardised approach. They ignored and dismissed the children's statements. They didn't perform checks as to whether it was taking place alongside gang activity. They didn't talk to one another, social services or the police. They didn't take on board the recommendations and requirements that they had already been given in previous reports. They weren't assessing the performance of their protective strategies, if they had any to begin with, to the point where 94% of them failed, and a third of them weren't meeting half of them. 82% of them failed to collect and produce data on CSE cases in 2012. And the big statement from this one as well was, we heard from too many professionals that children and young people, even though they were being exploited, were not hitting the threshold for statutory interventions, which was a complaint they echoed in call for evidence submissions. They just did not collect evidence. When it came to the police and the county police, 2/3 didn't have engagement because no one trusted them. Over half were concerned with the lack of disclosure. All of their strategies appeared to be about trying to encourage people to come forward and talk to them, as opposed to going out into the communities themselves. And given that most of these children were being terrorised, their families were being terrorised, if they were in care, then they had no one to turn to, and so they only had these perpetrators who would come up, honk their horn at the weekend and drag them away to be raped. Half of them stated that some victims didn't believe they were in need of support either, and many of them just did not know how to address the addition. Again, 43% of the LSCBs had no child sexual exploitation strategy in 2014, and there was no joint or local strategy. So that's a general overview, but I definitely recommend taking a look at the notes in these documents, and if you want more information, then they're in the videos there. Just imagine if this was reversed, it would be shut down instantly. We'd never hear the end of it. Yep, absolutely. So I'm just going to close the curtain slightly so I don't get blinded. Right. That's not quite good enough. There we go. The light is moving, ladies and gentlemen. But hopefully you can still see me. Where were we? Right. Services provided by the Bridges Project were high quality. Aftercare workers told us from their perspective the quality of support greatly improved in recent years. Yeah. Youth services played an important role in identifying and supporting children and young people involved in or at risk of CSE. The wider youth service was also active in this area with projects such as the Youth Start Counselling Service. This was a valuable resource for children. We met several experienced and skilled youth workers who voiced serious concerns about the severity of cuts to youth services and how it was impacting their work. Excuse me. I imagine this is all around the time when the Tory cuts were starting to come in. And I think if there was one area they were not to make cuts in, this is that area. The Rowan Centre provides education support and childcare to pregnant schoolgirls and young mothers. Babies are cared for on-site during the day whilst mothers receive their education. We read the case files of several CSE victims who received this support. It was child-focused and was engaging with and supporting the girls who had become pregnant whilst sexually exploited. The centre had been a positive experience for these girls, several of whom were able to support and successfully parent their children. Notice no fathers, obviously. There was also evidence of good collaboration between Risky Business and the centre. So there's that. There was very little by way of specialist support services in the form of mental health, counselling and psychological services for children and young people. Many suffered PTSD and endured lasting psychological and emotional damage that diminished their capacity to live normal lives. One survivor told us, "Sexual exploitation is like a circle that you can never escape from." We came across a number of cases where children and young people needed and wanted specialist counselling and support. They were unable to access these services because of long waiting lists and gaps in services. We learned that at the time of the inquiry, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service deleted children's names from the waiting list if they missed their first appointment. This was entirely unsuited to the needs of victims and should be changed. We were told by the parent of a survivor who needed help when she was over 16 that he had to pay privately to be put on the list because there was a 6-month waiting list for an appointment, which was too long in the life of a young woman who had experienced such trauma. So we're looking at there was virtually no post-trauma support. What little there was had long waiting lists, and if an appointment was missed, this led to the deletion of the victim's name from the waiting list. Thanks for the £2, Jester, I appreciate it. And you're welcome. What little service that I gave. Sunny day in England, who would have thunk it? Because of cowards. Safeguarding. So, for those of you who don't know, safeguarding is all about children. And children's social care, not usually for victims, but this is the preventative side of things. Over many years, an impressive amount of training on CSE was carried out. From 2008, annual CSE plans were produced and presented to the Safeguarding Board. The Child S Serious Case Review, commissioned by the Safeguarding Board, sparked a debate about redactions and whether absolute transparency should take precedence over protecting the confidential details of the children. Whilst we agreed that some redactions were unnecessary or could have been differently presented, we did not believe that a charge or of cover-up by the Safeguarding Board was justified. Well, of course you didn't. So Child S was the child who was murdered, and sparked a lot of this stuff off. So just going to copy this across. Child S Serious Case Review, commissioned by the Safeguarding Board, concluded that the redactions placed on the case to protect the child were exorbitant and constituted a cover-up. The J report contests this, but agrees that some redactions were unnecessary. Right. Just look at England's most popular name and different iterations of it. It tells you exactly what you need to know about where this country is heading. Yeah, I'm not particularly pleased about it either, Carson. I still maintain that we should ban halal. If this happened 100 years ago, heads would literally roll. It's a weird one. If you look at something like the immigration statistics, this couldn't have happened 100 years ago. There were, in 1996, 1 in 21 people in this country were of foreign descent, and now it's 1 in 6. As of 2011, that should be. I imagine the margin has shrunk even more. And whilst we don't have that much census data from before, I can guarantee that 100 years ago, much smaller, and obviously a much more, I guess, wartime spirit as well, and distrust and caution. But yes. It's very easy to make a secular argument for banning halal as well, which I think is why it should just be done. Right. The Children's Act established these LSCBs in 2004. So they didn't exist prior to 2004. Before then, it was even more disorganised and chaotic, right? But LSCBs were required to coordinate and ensure the effectiveness of services. They didn't, to put it shortly. Prior to the establishment of safeguarding boards, principal responsibilities were undertaken by ACPCs. That's Area Child Protection Committees, to those of you listening. The inquiry had access to the minutes of the safeguarding board. There were very, very few ACPC minutes. Approximately 40 sets of minutes from both were read. Let me see. We were reading the minutes of them. We read the minutes of the Sexual Exploitation Forum and the current CSE subgroup. There was a group called the Key Players, but we were unable to trace the minutes of them. Neither the council nor the police could trace the minutes of Key Players. This is particularly troubling because this included records of decision-making in individual cases. These minutes, or relevant extracts from them, were not placed in individual children's social care files, meaning that children who want information about their past would be denied this information. There was a confusion of responsibilities for response and decision-making. The Safeguarding Board and area ACPCs did a considerable amount of work trying to develop an interagency strategy from as early as 2001. However, we know that 94% of them weren't meeting those targets. Strategies, policies, and procedures were developed within the framework of government guidance in a document called Working Together to Safeguard Children. And extensive work was done on issues such as children's safety, with an interagency steering group established in 2005, and domestic violence, which was called Hidden Harm. As early as 1998, South Yorkshire Police issued a paper protecting children being sexually exploited through prostitution. Its procedures govern the practice. We'll have to have a look at that, actually. I'm just going to pop that in there. Okay. Its procedures govern the practice of the police and were adopted by Children's Social Care. The paper clearly set out the risks to the physical, emotional and psychological health of children engaged in prostitution or victims of sexual exploitation. It recognised the links between prostitution and crime, drug abuse, violence, murder, and urged that a high priority be given to the problem. Children under the age of 18 were regarded as children in need, protected under law. The priority for the police was to identify and prosecute offenders. Again, that kind of arbitrary 18 rating meant that anyone up to the age of 25 was kind of lost. 18 to 25 was kind of lost. There is evidence from the inquiry that suggests these precepts were not always followed. The ACPC procedures included a chapter which reiterated the 1998 ones. They were revised in 2003. The implied equivalence of child sexual exploitation with prostitution was very common in the 90s and persisted until 2005. Yeah. The Safeguarding Board frequently sought an agreed practical definition of CSE in order to ensure consistency. Even as late as October 2013, they discussed concerns about the distinction between sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, fearing that the terms were being used interchangeably. At the very least, disparities would affect the accuracy of performance figures, but they might have had more profound implications for practice. So they're very concerned about their figures. The Protocol on Missing Children was launched in 2005, aiming to focus agencies' minds on the risks to which such children were exposed. They undertook responsibility for managing its implementation and reviewing it in light of experience. The protocol was decentralised into local strategies with a view to engaging local practitioners, A&E departments and community groups. Local campaigns were envisaged, overseen by those working in each area. Rotherham was the only district in the force to respond formally to the problem through its community safety unit by visiting young runaways when they returned. And again, I imagine that was through risky business. The action plan on missing children was frequently reviewed in subsequent years. Okay. Things to take out of this. Protocol was established in 2005. Rotherham was the only policing district to respond to the problem. And here we are. The action plan was frequently reviewed. In 2008, the Children and Young People's Scrutiny Panel discussed the topic. Rotherham scored 14 out of 15 based on the self-assessment against national indicators for meeting this action plan. So it's not all bad, thankfully. Anyone of conscience who has seen halal slaughter would ban it. Let me see. Yes. Sol Invictus, thank you very much. $20. That's very generous. You sounded down on Twitter. I hope this cheers you up a bit. Yeah, last night was rough, man. I intended to delete that tweet shortly after sending it, and but I received such a warm response, I guess, of people who were well-meaning about that whole thing. I really appreciated it. It kind of blew up much more than I expected, and really did help. It really did. And certainly that $20 will be put to good use. Thank you very much, man. Agencies working together on possible links between missing children and sexual exploitation. An official visited schools and talked to Year 6 pupils. So for those of you who are foreign, Year 6 is 10, 11-year-olds, I think, about running away. An interagency action group met frequently to maintain a watching brief. They had the charity Safe at Last interview the children who went missing. Many missing children were identified through fraudulent benefit claims. Interesting. The subject featured large in the work plan, which the exploitation subgroup submitted in 2010. The plan engaged voluntary and other agencies in addressing the problem, which became more severe in Rotherham over recent years. The proportion of missing looked after children was higher than the national average, but it doesn't tell us how. And there was a sharp increase of numbers of missing children in their mid-teens. I want the stats on that. It's a shame that they haven't put them in there. Again, it's what these things omit. They want you to kind of brush over this and not be worried about it. But let me have a look-see. So, Rotherham commissioned the charity Save at Last to interview children who went missing. Missing, and key thing for that, the boroughs proportion of missing looked after children was much higher than the national average, and there was a sharp increase in the number of missing children in their mid-teens. Again, I'm just going to put a comment on this. Just say stats missing. And maybe we can find them later. I see a lot of messages retracted from you, Varying Redbeard. Everything alright? Take care, Autochath. Nice to see you. There we are. Just double check. Lovely. Alrighty then, let's get back to it. Up to page 66. We're only an hour and 20 minutes in, so we'll see if we can get through the rest of this report then. Okay, what plans did they actually have? Let's see. Let's see what they actually had. Plans to tackle CSE. Let's have a look. At the end of 2005, they had approved a comprehensive action plan, which included work in schools, preventative methodologies, provision of advice to young people, services to young men and boys at risk of sexual exploitation, systems of recording and analysis, gathering of evidence, support for child witnesses. Sexual exploitation was required to be a priority in the Stay Safe section of the Children and Young People Single Plan. Responding to CSE in Rotherham, compiled by the Police and Children's Social Care in 2005, imposed the Common Assessment Form. So it looks like standardisation of risk assessment and where is this? Yeah. Standardization of risk assessment and questioning was established in 2005. There was a clause retained giving advice to the young person on 2 occasions before proceeding to caution or prosecution. Also, the clause making a case conference dependent on the parent having encouraged the young person's behaviour. Reiterated the need to investigate and prosecute those who coerce, exploit and abuse children. Prioritised cases where family or adults involved encouraged CSE. Although this was only after advice had been given to the victim on 2 occasions prior to intervention or prosecution. Yeah, it's just PDF, man. It's muck. The formatting is odd because it's a PDF. In October 2006, they completed and circulated this, right? So this was developed and distributed by, what did I say, October 2006. In 2008, they were more concerned. They became more concerned about the exploitation of boys and young men. Concern about this issue had been expressed as far back as 2002. Let me close my WhatsApp. A staff member was now deployed to research the nature, context, and extent of exploitation, the degree to which boys were affected, and the range of services that should be provided. Okay. One staff member. To assess the risk of CSE and grooming on boys and young men. Over the following months, procedures were compiled or revised on missing children, children who were trafficked, children who harm others, safeguarding girls and young women at risk of female genital mutilation. Safeguarding children guidance was a new policy designed for madrasas, mosques, and supplementary schools. In 2009, it was proposed that the procedures relating to CSE should be revised to conform to new national guidance on the safeguarding of children. Sheffield had taken an initiative in this direction with a view to agreeing procedures common to both authorities. Rotherham was described as having taken the most proactive approach to dealing with CSE compared to other areas. Again, this is why we know the most about Rotherham. It's not that it's the worst area affected. In fact, it is I would not be surprised if it's one of the least areas affected by this problem, but that it has taken the most proactive approach, mainly due to the efforts of Risky Business and its folding into the CSE team. Andrew Frost, if this is bad in the UK, how bad is it in Europe? Yeah, we have reports that we may get onto once we finish covering the UK, particularly about places like Sweden, Denmark, Germany, so and potentially Italy, because there was a lot going on in Rome, but we'll see. Captain Bees, correct me please if I'm talking out my backside, but isn't the incidence of CSE of boys within the group we are discussing here quite high? I can't remember. If I just go back up to the scale, if I just find boys. Boys often overlooked, but I don't think we have an actual a statistic on it, because they just didn't look at it. I'm going to turn this thing off here. So there's that. But it looks like in many of the cases, for the boys at least, it was a kind of rite of passage thing. So what would happen was the boy would be threatened with rape himself. He would be brought in and encouraged to rape along with family members and so on. I was shown by CDog actually in the chat. He sent me a link to a case study where they literally would get people on the phone. Like, they would go to a house, there would be about 15 guys there, and they'd say, oh, we've got 3 girls in today. And they would say, oh, you'd call your friend, you'd call your dad, you'd call your uncles, you'd call everyone else that you could think of. And then they would file into the home, and they would be lined up down the street, and then they would run a train on all the girls, one after the other. And one of the biggest problems with it was, as well as anything else, they just don't look at it as rape. They're just going, oh, like this girl, she comes here, we have sex with her. We don't pay her, but we give her food and a warm place to stay at night, and then we just take her back to the home in the morning. It's horrendous. I don't think this is a problem here in Germany. We have the Cologne New Year's Eve type events. Some guys trying to start Sharia patrol were instantly booed at, and that doesn't happen. I don't know enough about Germany, man. As I say, it's just an example of where I would expect there to be problems, but I haven't looked into it in too much depth. Right. Wasn't there a Dutch politician who was assassinated because he might have known about this? If there is, please link it to me. I haven't heard anything about it yet. But there we are. Cheers, not so obvious, but excuse me whilst I get my pitchfork. Yeah. so the boys would be taken in, and they're sort of 12 to 15, and they're encouraged into this behaviour by their family, friends, and then if in some cases where there was a more protracted gang violence, they would be expected as kind of an initiation to either perpetrate the violence or face rape themselves. And in many cases, especially in I think some of the stuff that we saw in this CSE report up the top here, that the boys were inviting what was I looking at here? No. So they would do various ways. Almost all cases of CSE reviewed involved pornographic punishment, sexual assault, violent sexual assault, filming and distribution of rape, and vast numbers of girls labelled as easy. Yeah. Right. Back to what they claim they attempted to do. Yes. Children and Young Persons Plan 2010 to 2013 brought forward another number of interconnected strategies under 4 broad headings. So they attempted to do prevention, early intervention, tackling inequality, and education. Strategies on organised or multiple abuse and sexual exploitation were tabled at this time. In 2010, the Safeguarding Board approved further policies on forced marriage, honour-based violence, organised multiple abuse management of people who pose a risk to young people, safeguarding children from sexual exploitation. It planned to update all policies and procedures twice a year, and a company called TriX was commissioned to maintain the Safeguarding Board's library of policies and procedures. They were then reappraised in 2011. It was intended that staff would refer to the procedures online rather than using paper. The website gave a single version of the procedures regularly updated, accessible to all. In the same year, the Practice Resolution Protocol was developed. In 2012, there were calls for a clearer definition of referral processes and the threshold criteria to be agreed by all agencies, suggesting that debates on these topics from 2005 remain unresolved. So let's pop that in there. It was also proposed that a suitable shared multi-agency recording system be devised to include information about adults who may be linked. So again, this is as late as 2012, and they are still not collecting data on the abusers. They are only really collecting data on the children, if at all. And the children that they're collecting data on, their main goal is to get them away from the situation that they're in, not to target and take down the abusers who are abusing multiple children. So there's that. Right. Yes. Sent to you on Discord. Thanks, Callum. Appreciate it. Yes, so this is the case study that's just been sent to me. My mate called me and said, "Bro, I have a surprise for you. Come over to this house." When I got there, 15 of them were sitting in the living room. My mate told me to go upstairs for my surprise. When I went into the bedroom, another friend was having sex, was doing this girl. She was 20 years old, of a Pakistani background. The lads went up one by one and took turns. And while they were waiting, they were calling their mates, cousins and uncles to come over and join in and show off. Others turned up too, including 2 older men who were taxi drivers who went straight upstairs. One older man said, "I'm going to call my son over so he can practice on her." And later, his 15-year-old son arrived in his uniform. That's his school uniform. Everyone took turns, and it took 6 hours. I did get concerned and said, "This girl is going to get broke. Who will marry her? This girl is not paid, but she gets looked after. She is given food, and the boys make sure she gets home safely if it gets late. There are set days, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, but some of my friends don't like doing stuff like that on a Friday because it's a holy day, and they go to mosque." He then went on to recount another similar story of 6 boys in their late teens calling their friends to come and have sex with a girl they had in the house. He explained that often the girl went out with one of the boys, who then passed her on to another, and then on to another, until everyone shared her. Yeah. So there's that. And it's part of a document called Unheard Voices, so dead useful. I will put that in my resources, and hopefully that'll be another one to have on there. If indeed it will let me copy it across. There we go. Grim. Right. Where were we? That's what I mean when I say cousins, uncles, fathers and sons. Andrew Frost saying Pim Fortuyn in 03 he was tipped to become the Dutch Prime Minister. Useful. I will note that down, and I will just pop that again in the resources, and we'll see what we can get from that later. Dutch politician. This is a whole other form of rape than what the UK has seen previously. Yes, this is organised, it is consistent, it is national, and it is just unbelievably brutal. 6 hours. And apparently you could tell by the people lined up down the street. So yeah, it's grim. Representation and accountability. So we've already covered that. The debates on the topics were unresolved. Okay. Current CSE subgroup served to reduce a problem which has beset the Safeguarding Board from its early days, that of sheer size. In the interest of inclusiveness, board membership has progressively increased. Fewer than 20 people attended its first meetings. As the meetings became larger, it became more difficult for the chair to give due weight to the varying interests represented, and to encourage a full and open debate, and reach definitive conclusions which attract the agreement of all present. Excuse me. In addition, the chair has the responsibility to ensure that decisions are acted upon timeously and to a high standard. Is timeously even a word? Never mind. Not only does this make the task difficult for a part-time chair, it also raises questions about the concept of accountability as applied to such a large, disparate group of people. It is not the place of the inquiry to explore those questions further. It is sufficient to be reminded that accountability for successful outcomes is a central feature of good child protection work. The concept of shared accountability, which some apply to the work of safeguarding boards, is dubious and potentially dangerous. Let's just read that paragraph again. So the meeting started at 20 people. They became much larger, although it doesn't say how much larger, and the chair struggled to deal with everything that was being discussed. How much did they want to make the Safeguarding Board accountable? Especially when it was part-time. The issue of thresholds typifies a problem which the Safeguarding Board and its predecessor faced from the earlier years, that of ensuring compliance with agreements on the part of all its members. Child protection procedures and protocols produced in the 90s and 2000s were of good quality, but adherence was variable. So, worthless then if no one was adhering to them. Similar problems attended the training programs. Interagency on CSE was instituted in the early 2000s, particularly on awareness raising. It was commended by the leader of the council for calling for its extension, but the level of uptake was low. So no one was going to the training even when they did offer it. Poor uptake was not universal, but its frequency called into question and the authority that the Safeguarding Board exercised over its members. Likewise, considerable time and energy was expended on devising good policies and procedures in the mid to late 2000s, but there was rarely any reporting back or checking by the Safeguarding Board on whether or not they were being implemented or working. Again, this is things that I'm not going to note it down again, because we know it from the other report on CSE, which said that we have better stats from that other report on the failings of this training, right? Okay. I'm sorry that it's distressed you, Zachary. Now let's have a look at this training, though. They had a responsibility to train persons who work with children and affect the safety and welfare of children. All agencies provided such services had a like responsibility to ensure they were effective doing it. Risky Business delivered training programs. This was coordinated through the Key Players Group. Priority was given to a multi-agency model. Blah, 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 blah. Management speak. Training sessions were well received. In particular, training delivered by young survivors, which was described as having a huge impact. It was open to voluntary agencies, was well publicised. Again, Risky Business being the only one who provides anything of any worth. Over the years, the Safeguarding Board faced a number of recurrent problems related to training. Agencies gave varying priority to the training. Attendance was sometimes poor, the costs often exceeded the budget, it was difficult to recruit trainers. In 2005, it was proposed that a charging system be introduced where agencies were billed if they did not attend. Whether or not that was implemented is also unclear. The demand for training in CSE was ever increasing, as was its scope. The Leaders Task and Finish Group called for more awareness training, particularly in CSE. The subcommittee undertook training around the conduct of serious case reviews. Training in child protection was launched for mosques and community representatives. Housing, licensing, and other staff were included in the programme. Risky Business even trained dog walkers and park rangers. Again, I cannot commend Risky Business enough. Imagine being the only organisation with any credibility and being that committed to making a positive impact. I mean, really. Nothing but respect for them at the moment. By the end of 2006, it was clear that the overall training programme could not be expanded unless capacity was increased. But the new budget meant that the cancellation of 106 trainer days. In response, the Safeguarding Board made further efforts to impose a more structured method of identifying and meeting the needs of training. But again, it seems like they had a problem with just non-attendance. The development of e-learning was encouraged. Feedback was excellent from the Safeguarding Board. It was considered valuable in meeting the needs for induction within isolated agencies that couldn't access the training. All agencies were asked to nominate staff who would benefit from e-learning as part of an induction or refresher. Yes. Risky Business was asked to contribute to the training of newly recruited police officers in 2007. 3-day training courses were also delivered for senior police officers. Sexual exploitation of children featured in these programs, although to what extent is unclear. The scope of training further increased to include safeguarding children with disabilities, sexually harmful behaviour, the assessment of parental mental health, attachment theory, which I have a video on, forced marriages and public law. Between 2007 and 2008, Risky Business delivered training to 5 comprehensive schools, police community PCSOs, to youth workers, foster carers and magistrates. This training formed the path of the standard package for all new magistrates. Courses were now modular in form, more flexible. A training package was designed specifically for school staff to deliver. This spread the material more widely and economically. By 2012, it seemed that the CSE had become a standard feature in the planning of training programs. A training package in CSE was designed for Muslim community leaders, and the Safeguarding Board provided a training course in the identification of indicators relating to CSE. Again, it's unclear how effective that is, especially given that, according to the scripture, Muslim community leaders would be on board with a lot of it. And really all they were doing is providing ways in which they could understand their enemy, as it were. In March 2013, it was reported that all schools, including the faith schools, had signed up for training related to CSE. Members of the Safeguarding Board devoted time to the discussion of this e-learning package. Let's have a look. The function of the board to ensure effectiveness, question, scrutinise, demand and assess evidence was not exercised. The full establishment of the CSE subgroup has gone some way to correcting this, improving quality assurance. The parent of a CSE survivor was approached by a senior officer of the council to become a lay member of the Safeguarding Board in 2010. He told the inquiry that he found action on important issues too slow, suggesting that the board did not take the issue of CSE seriously enough. He reported that they had many good debates, but the minutes never reflected disagreements. He resigned in 2012. Again, that's a useful finding. While this report carries criticisms of the work of the Safeguarding Board over the last 10 years, the inquiry considers that several chairs and members should be recognised for the work they've done, blah 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 blah. There's been a fundamental shift in the way they understand CSE. They now correctly define child sexual exploitation not as child prostitution. Risky business was good and ahead of its time. Right. One exception was the work of the Key Players Group. Government guidance was clear at the time that CSE was to be dealt with as an issue of safeguarding children. However, many child victims in Rotherham were not dealt with through a safeguarding procedure. From other reports on the problem of CSE, it appears that this failure was not unique to Rotherham. Now, why do we not have this? Unless we can get... No, it's HTTPS. Ooh. Let's try... and Google it. Right, we'll have to hunt this one down. Ooh. If anyone has a Wayback Machine that works on this, maybe. Right. Surprised the people at Risky Business weren't arrested after all. Yeah. It's pretty grim. Let's find out whether or not we can get this this to work. It's not been archived. It's a shame. It's a real shame. Okay. We'll have to dead link. needs finding. Right. From about 2007, with the appointment of a dedicated CSE manager, there was an improved focus on safeguarding children who were being exploited. This was evidenced in CSE strategies and action plans and a clear pathway for referrals. Nevertheless, safeguarding of individuals was extremely variable. Professional supervision of children's social care staff plays an important role in ensuring a high quality of social work practice and good case management. Comprehensive supervision policy should provide the employer and employee with a framework, blah 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 blah. More managerial speak, really. Interesting. The former required that all staff knew who was responsible for their case supervision and there was clear accountability. They referred to risky business staff who should be the subject of greater management oversight and supervision. They were then incorporated into the central CSE team following the publication of the Child S report. So now we know why they were there. Whether or not that is a shut them up, shut them up, shut them up, or whether or not that is a genuine, they're doing good work and we need to fold them into things. But more supervision seems very dodgy to me. Yeah. That goes there. Inspection reports on children's social care over the inquiry period included several references to the quality and frequency of supervision. It was criticised in 2003, then in 2009, then again in 2011, then in 2011. It was described as variable and poor. The impact of supervision was seen in 54% of cases and 88% of open cases. Good improvement over time. Many cases were very serious levels of sexual exploitation. It was striking that apart from a lessons learned review, there were no systems in place for agencies to learn lessons from serious CSE cases in which children have been failed. The absence of active learning by any agencies in their most serious cases contributed to the repetition of poor practice. The Lessons Learned Review was not a full Lessons Learned Review. The intention was to follow it up after criminal proceedings finished, which didn't happen. We also considered that the original review was weak. It only examined a single case, although charges were brought for 4 children. In respect of 4 children, I should say. There was also a much wider group of children identified during Operation Central who were sexually exploited, but cases did not get to court. It would have been appropriate to identify lessons to be learned from what happened with this group as well. One of the potential areas for improvement should have been retrospective learning from the police operations SAR and CHARD, which we've mentioned previously, that failed to result in any prosecutions. They could find no evidence of agencies jointly reviewing what happened in these cases and learning lessons for the future. Again, note that SAR and CHARD had no prosecutions, and I think Central only had 5. Only 5 people, and we know that there are hundreds of them. At the time of the inquiry, there was only 1 post dedicated to quality assurance of safeguarding. They're already making better risk assessments, blah blah, and giving QA. Which is again why it's clear that more and more victims are coming forward. Which is what we would expect. Safeguarding Board commissioned only 1 serious case review involving CSE, which is Child S, who was murdered in 2010 at the age of 17. While there has been dispute over the motivation for her murder and whether it was CSE related, she was at risk of CSE when she was young and was in contact with some of the worst perpetrators. Let me see. And thank you, Immaterial, for linking me up on Discord with regards to that that report that we couldn't find. Let me see. Oh my. I will need to thank someone on Fake Accents Unite who's donated €20 to me. Dear. Mannequin go. Right. Anyway. So is grooming a hate crime? I would say so, given the extent of it. But again, these reports are deliberately, I say deliberately, again, they're government reports, right? They're really concerned, as opposed to getting to the bottom of the details, they are trying to get to them, but without offending anybody, apart from the bodies which they're obviously investigating. And it's really frustrating because it means that they collect virtually no data on things like the ethnicity, the ethnic breakdown, and the motivations of the perpetrators. This report has nothing really about the motivations of the perpetrators so far. It's characterizing the experience of the victims and the mismanagement of the organizations, but nothing dealing with the cases when it comes to the perpetrators. When we come on to hopefully in the next day or so, possibly tomorrow, I will accelerate it because I'm aware that so for those of you who don't know, there is going to be a board hearing in a certain location, and Tommy Robinson is going to give some evidence, and hopefully part of this exchange will be collaborative with him and provide some evidence which is backupable for him to present to that inquiry. But yes, I'll accelerate trying to substantiate some claims and work on the perpetrators, because as far as I can tell, there's been very little on the actual perpetrators that I can find so far. As for hate crimes in general, well, I might reach out to Peter McLaughlin, I think his name is, who's done a lot of work on Rotherham specifically. It's really hard to know what it's like on a national level. Again, a lot of it's hidden, and a lot of it is just not available because they are so inconsistent. There was no standardization prior to 2005 when it came to any of this stuff. So I will try my best to find it for you, but nothing yet. Nothing as yet. Where is this? Oh yes, so we're looking at the Child S thing. Excuse me. The author, Professor Pat Cantrill, was asked by the Safeguarding Board to examine Child S's circumstances, and the report was redacted to protect the child involved prior to publication. Professor Cantrill carried out the redactions herself. They were very contentious and directly involved Michael Gove, which was the we've already read part of that report. He wrote to the Safeguarding Board to say some of the redactions were unnecessary. They followed an unedifying set of exchanges between the Department for Education and the chair of the Safeguarding Board. At one point, the Department for Education lost a copy of the serious case review, which contained revised redactions. Lost! Right. I will be right back, everyone. I just need to pop to the bathroom, but I'll be right back. Right. Grooming is most certainly a hate crime. The perpetrators deeply disrespect the victims. It doesn't even include race or religion because Pakistani girls are treated like that too. I haven't seen Pakistani girls in the court cases. There's some then muck. As far as I'm aware, there's none in the court cases. But obviously, I think there's definitely a religious motivation. Wouldn't surprise me either if it had degenerated over time. So, let's say it starts off just being the white kafir, and then they expand to their own people when they effectively run out of victims there. The Pakistani culture is degenerate in many ways. I'm sure, for the sake of anyone out there who's from the community, that there may be some good elements, but when I hear of a case where a man attempts to petition the King of Pakistan so that his brother can rape his ex-wife so that he'll be forced to remarry her because he regretted getting a divorce, then I just think that there's something sick and deeply wrong with your society. Right. Let me see what we have. Any review of services provided to protect children from physical and sexual abuse and exploitation is undoubtedly and properly a matter of public interest. Public interest must be balanced against considerations for the future well-being of any children and young people mentioned in the review. The overview report on Child S had two purposes: to describe and assess the conduct of professionals and to indicate the lessons to be learned. Right. Okay. Right. Young people in the family concerned had their lives ahead of them. So yes, they need to protect victims. We recommend that the Department of Education should not demand the removal of redactions without giving thought to all the children concerned. Children's welfare must be paramount. So let's have a look at how the South Yorkshire Police dealt with things. South Yorkshire Police at some point have come up several times as part of the report. Whilst there was liaison between the police, risky business and social care from the early days of risky business, there were very many historic cases where the operational response of the police was far short of what could be expected, and this is something we see time and time again. The reasons for this are not entirely clear. I have two words for you: Macpherson Report. That's why. The police had excellent procedures from 1998, but in practice they were disregarded. Okay, so like South Yorkshire Police had procedures in place to tackle CSE from 1998. Again, funnily enough, a year after they started collaborating with Risky Business after its inception. So again, I would put that down to a good thing implemented by Risky Business. However, these were disregarded. Because why? Why not? Let's have a look. Clearly there is evidence that police officers on the ground in the 90s and well beyond displayed attitudes that conveyed a serious lack of understanding of the problem of CSE, the nature of grooming. Children as young as 11 were deemed to have be having consensual sexual intercourse when in fact they were being raped and abused by adults. We were contacted by someone who worked at the Rotherham Interchange in the early 2000s. He described how the police refused to intervene when young girls thought to be victims of CSE were being beaten and abused by perpetrators. According to him, the attitude of the police was that they were undesirables and not worthy of police protection. Sorry about that. There are cases in Pakistan itself where the sister gets raped by a bunch of men for something the brother allegedly did. Yeah. By 2007, there was evidence that the police were more proactive in tackling CSE. So I just want to put 2000 there. 2007. They were more proactive. Senior police officers established good liaison arrangements with risky business. Funny that. Again, risky business. Anything good happens. Risky business. Anything bad happens. Everything else. Progress is being made protecting children, investigating perpetrators. Police were commended for handling one successful prosecution in 2007. Work began on what would eventually lead to the prosecution of 5 offenders in 2009 as part of Operation Central. So again, 2007, 1 prosecution. 2009, 5 prosecutions. Not much, is it? Again, Operation Central there. Given a drive to recruit police officers from the group we are discussing, do we have any idea of how many of said officers were directly complicit? No, although we do know, for instance, that one of the most high-profile officers who was brought in from that community, that being the Pakistani community, was recently has been put on a tribunal because he appeared to be running one of these grooming gangs. So there's that. I think Sargon did a video on it. I need to get after him for the sources on that. We interviewed many serving police officers at different levels of seniority during the fieldwork for the inquiry. It was clear that tackling CSE was now a priority for SYP, and we describe elsewhere their contribution to interagency response. Sure. So that's 2014. There are a number of recent and ongoing police investigations. Yes, we know about Tsar, Chard, and Central. They were included investigations into historic abuse cases, one a Rotherham investigation and a second Yorkshire-wide. There were recent operations to target suspected hotels and limousine companies, and an operation was underway looking at high-risk missing children. Joint training of hotel managers had resulted in one perpetrator being caught with 2 underage girls. Now, that doesn't tell us what happened to him or those girls, because as we know from previous research, what ends up happening is that in some cases, even if they were there with pornography of the child they were with and had admitted to having raped the child, they were just given a caution. So, not sure about that. A police analyst is now based in Rotherham, produces a well-presented monthly report on CSE, giving progress, greatly improving the quality of information received for monitoring purposes. They think that the police are now appropriately resourced, have a clear focus on prevention, protection, and prosecution. There is a child-centered focus and demonstrated a commitment to continuous improvement. Okay. Perpetrators targeted schools. There was evidence in the files that schools were proactive, alerting risky business to signs and evidence of exploitation. And risky business was providing them training programs, including 14 secondary schools. Nothing much to report here. Young people we met in the course of the inquiry were scathing about the sex education they received. They complained it only focused on contraception. Those who received risky business awareness raising about CSE thought it was very good, especially when a survivor spoke to them about their experience. They thought sex education was out of touch and needed updating. Okay. Schools. An unannounced Ofsted inspection said that they'd done well. Sometimes the girl gets arrested. Yeah. No problem, Captain Bees. No worries. I keep coming back to that main observation that these gang members are often cousins, uncles, fathers and sons. They are typical Muslim families, not Islamists. One of the common threads running through CSE across England is the prominent role of taxi drivers, being directly linked to children who are abused. Ban taxis, that's what I say. This was the case in Rotherham from an early stage when residential care homes met in the 90s to share intelligence about taxis and other cars picking girls up. In the early 2000s, in the noughties, secondary school heads were reporting girls being picked up at lunchtime at the school gates and taken away to give blowjobs. A diagram and backing papers supplied to the police in 01 by Risky Business linked alleged perpetrators with victims, taxi companies, and individual drivers. In the borough, there were 1,200 to 1,300 licensed taxi drivers, although not all were active. There were well over 100 licensed taxi operators, so the companies. The licensing of the vehicles and the drivers is the responsibility of the local authority. There were statutory tests that needed to be complied with before a driving licence was granted. Taxi driver licence. The primary concern was for the fit and proper test of the individual, but there is no legal definition of what this means. In Rotherham, applicants were obliged to obtain an enhanced disclosure DBS. The DBS check used the police national computer information as the standard check, but included a check of police intelligence records held locally. Again, this is a problem if the head of the taxi company ends up being an abuser himself, hiring other abusers. The occupation of taxi driver is a notifiable occupation. The licensing authority gets informed and may suspend or revoke the license if it's in the interest of public safety to do so. In 2010, they decided that directors needed to know about all suspensions, even temporary ones. See what I can put in here, Finn. There are 1,300 to 1,500 taxi drivers in Rotherham operating under 100 operators. They are discussed once every 8 weeks with the police, fire, child safeguarding, public health and others. But there have been no record about specific actions being taken. In 2008, part of the preventative agenda was encouraging recognition and referral of young people thought to be at risk. The Safeguarding Unit convened strategy meetings from time to time on allegations involving taxi drivers. We read some of the most serious from 2010 and were struck by the sense of exasperation, hopelessness recorded as the professionals in attendance tried to find ways to disrupt the suspected activity. Strategy meetings about one specific taxi were held on 4 occasions in a 7-week period. The minutes of one meeting record a total of 10 girls and young women, 3 of whom were involved in 3 separate incidences of attempted abduction. 7 other girls alleged that they were being sexually exploited in exchange for free taxi rides and goods. 2 of the girls involved were looked after children. The licensing enforcement officer took the step of formally writing to the police following the instances of alleged abduction, complaining about the police's failure to act. In one incident, a driver accosted a 13-year-old. She refused to do what he asked, and he reported this to her parents, who followed the taxi through town, where they managed to identify the driver and dialed 999 for assistance. The police did not attend, took no action. In his email to the police, he stated that a simple check would have revealed that the driver had been arrested the week previously for successfully kidnapping a lone female. He concluded by acknowledging that the police's priorities were not the same as licensing, but he should not be holding this together on his own. So the police failed to attend, attempted rapes, exploitation, kidnapping, and took no action, even when given hard evidence. This was much to the exasperation of is it licensing? Yeah. Of the current licensing enforcement officer who reported his frustrations to the police after a case involving 10 girls and a single perpetrator were routinely ignored. So there we are. Whew, that's a tough story there. Right. Okay. 78 pages. We'll try and go to 100 today. And then we'll hopefully deal with the rest of it tomorrow. Further issue of safeguarding concerned taxi firms which had a contract to transport vulnerable children to resources within the authority. Some of the council's difficulty was that they did not always have the drivers' names when allegations were made, or a list of the drivers transporting children as part of the council contract. So not only was this going on, the council contracted various taxi services to transport at-risk and vulnerable girls who were then exploited, and the council had no records of the drivers who abused their charges. Welcome back, Andrew. So there was a formal procedure for the referral and communication of concerns. A plan for safeguarding, for child safeguarding training for taxi drivers was also put together. Yeah, because the abuser's just going to look at that safeguarding training and go, yeah, okay, we should really protect the children who we're abusing. I think not. It was mandatory as part of the application process, and existing drivers were targeted in a phased way. There was also a taxi driver's handbook produced, which included CSE and safeguarding issues. 4 CSE-related cases of taxi drivers resulted in the revocation of licences. Only 4. And they worked for 4 different companies. Remember, there are only 100 operators. So that's like 4% of the operators. Like, imagine if you had a 1 in 20 chance to get in a taxi and it be a rapist. And that's just the successful prosecutions, right? Or successful revocation. The Child Protective Service decided not to charge him due to the perceived unreliability of one of the prosecution witnesses, and the driver requested that the immediate suspension of his licence be lifted. However, it was fully revoked. Council licensing staff described their relations with taxis as very difficult on occasion, but they'd always taken the right course of action on safeguarding issues. They worked closely with the police, mostly on soft intelligence, since written information tended to be much blander. In a number of different meetings, the inquiry talked to 24 young people aged 14 to 25 who lived in the area. One of the main items for discussion with them was safe transport. When asked about taxis, there was an immediate and consistent response from all of the young women and men on every occasion. All avoided the use of taxis, if at all possible. Their parents and partners strongly discouraged, even forbade them from being on their own at night in a taxi, unless it was a company that they personally knew. The girls described how on occasions they had been taken on the longest and the darkest route home. One said that the driver's first question would always be, "How old are you, love?" All talked about the content of their conversation, quickly turning to sex. Just noting that down. There we go. All the young people much preferred to use the bus, despite their nervousness and dislike of the Rotherham interchange, which they described as attracting drug dealers, addicts, and criminals. Many of these people congregated outside the bus station, and the young people described their sense of intimidation and considered it to be running the gauntlet to get to their buses. The use of limousines for the purposes of sexual exploitation was raised by a number of people as a historic and current issue. It was also discussed at the Safeguarding Board in 2011. Such vehicles with more than 8 seats are nationally regulated by the DVSA, the Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency. In Rotherham, they have recently been seen waiting for young girls outside school gates. The police have targeted limousine companies as part of organised operations to prevent child sexual exploitation. Let's have a look at the Crown Prosecution Service then. Grooming gangs use taxis during the daytime to befriend the girls, giving them free rides to and from school. Yeah. I have cousins who are the right age to be victims of this. Yeah, me too. I'm not giving the Conservatives a free ride, but diversity and racism have been the main talking points of Labour for a long time now. It's both of them, and this is certainly not something which has happened under a single government. However, one of the things that we do note from very early on is that Labour Rotherham in particular, and what I suspect we will find in most of these cases is that majority are Labour councillors who are doing this. If we find damning evidence about the messages from things, so there's one which is like, it's not for you police officers to get involved in this, right, which came down from the council supposedly. If we can trace things like that, I think it will implicate the right people. British Knight, thanks for the £10. That's very generous of you. Have you seen Korea has developed VR recreations of the dead, recreated the image of the dead child, and tested it on her mother? It's like a real life, I presume that is, mirror of Erised. I know nothing about this, actually. Feel free to give me more information on it. Is it particularly related to this as well? I'm just curious. Yes, it doesn't start with rape. It's always under the... And they don't see it as thus until it happens. Consistently across the... every case, one of the consistent stories is like they're 12 years old, they meet this guy, he already has a girlfriend, she's very young, but, you know, on similar age to her. He's her friend. He gives her free rides. He gives her either drugs or sweets or toys or whatever. And then after about 2 or 3 weeks, he says, "Do you want to come to a party?" She says yes. She goes to the party, gets late. She gets tired. She goes to sleep upstairs in one of the beds. He comes in. She's not worried because it's her friend. And then he rapes her. And then it goes on, and then another one will come in, and the rape continues. Yeah. But yes, there's that. Where was I? Let's see. Crown Prosecution Service. It is not proved possible to follow up individual cases where there are reference to the CPS and files and minutes dating back to 1997. We were told that those in the CPS before 2010 who would have dealt with child sexual exploitation had all retired. For much of the period under review, the police would cite the requirements of the CPS, their unwillingness to charge alleged perpetrators, as the main reason so few prosecutions were pursued. Okay. So let's go back up here to South Yorkshire Police. I think this is relevant. So there's that. Yeah, alcohol to make her tired. Yeah. It's grim. Andrew Frost, if I had a daughter and she was a victim of this, I wouldn't go to the police. Yeah, the consistent thing that we saw with fathers was that, and it's hard to say, but the fathers would quite often, being working class chaps and trying to deal with this, they would quite often be sent pornography of their child being raped, and they would then get drunk and attempt to go and rescue their children. Some of them said to the police that they were going to attempt to get their children back. Often they were quite disorderly, hammering on the doors of the houses where they knew their children were being kept. And then the police would arrest them for being drunk and disorderly when they were perhaps 3 feet, and they were laughed at by the perpetrators. It's very sad. In 2003, an SSI inspection noted that when the police investigated and referred a case to the Crown Prosecution Service, it took them 9 months to decide not to pursue a case. So, I'm just going to unbold that. So, it's a long set of procedures. Procedures were insufferably long. I don't care how professional this is. Like, I'm trying my best to be professional without having very, very, very rude words in this document. Not related, but since you're a psychology student, I thought the effects of this might be something you'd care to explore. I think it's an unhealthy thing to tempt people with. Yes, I don't like the idea of it. It's bad enough for parents with their children as it is, without offering them the kind of bizarre Black Mirror-esque falsehood, shall we say. Personally. Right. The Crown Prosecution Service recently underwent internal reorganisation. CPS in Sheffield no longer deals with sexual offences, including CSE. A unit in Leeds and one in Hull now cover the South Yorkshire police area. So, I'm going to put CPS here and then say, so CPS was reorganised in, when did it say, 2000 and 2014, that will be recently. Boundaries between authorities have shifted. Within the safeguarding board minutes, there was rarely reference to the CPS. It was noted in Operation Shard that it would be useful to know how the CPS reached its conclusion on a case. The board subsequently invited a representative from the CPS to discuss Operation Shard. It looks like nothing happened. In June 2013, it was noted by the Safeguarding Board that they sought representation to serve on the CSE subgroup, but no representative was secured. So again, they don't want anything to do with it. Seems to be the case. Senior police officers reported CPS were much more helpful recently, but there are many other issues that raised in other reports about the protection and support of child witnesses addressed in a new national policy. Blah blah. What will happen is not what we're interested in. What has happened is what we are interested in. One survivor told us that victims who were witnesses needed more support to get them through the process. Very little was offered as support after the trial. CPS should review cases. In 2013, in October, the Director of Public Prosecutions, one Keir Starmer, revised the CPS guidance on CSE to set out a clear, agreed approach which prosecutors would use to cover it. A list of stereotypical behaviours previously thought to undermine the credibility of young victims was included to dispel associated myths. These included the victim inviting sex by the way they dressed or acted, the victim using alcohol or drugs, being sexually available, the victim didn't scream, fight or protest, so must have consented, didn't immediately complain, so it can't have been an assault, the victim was in a relationship and is therefore a willing partner, they were inconsistent at remembering events, children can consent to their own sexual exploitation, CSE is only a problem in certain ethnic, cultural communities, only girls and young women are victims. See, that's the thing. CSE is only a problem in certain ethnic, cultural communities, i.e. white people. White people are the only people who can perpetrate it, and it's only an issue in these other communities. And that's what I'm getting from that. Even though that's a very misleading statement, given the current cultural context. Only girls and young women being victims, children from black and minority ethnic backgrounds not being abused. Well, we know they were, especially if they were Sikh. There would be physical evidence of abuse, which again, not always. Let's see. Be careful of U2. This is some dark stuff. Make sure you give your brain other stuff too. Geigo psychology. Yeah, like this is a project that I need to do. Otherwise, I don't sleep. It's bad enough that it doesn't. Again, trying to stay away from too many case studies, and trying to get to the root of what went on in the organisations. How were the victims treated or not treated in this case, which I think we've got a really good handle on, especially in Rotherham here, and then ultimately whether or not anyone is individually can be found who can be responsible for covering things up in a meaningful way. Yes, these were myths. Remember that these are myths that they're trying to overcome that were apparently present in people. Remember again that the majority of the victims were people who were considered out of control. These children were considered out of control. They were problems for the police. They didn't engage with services. In many cases, they believed that they weren't being abused themselves, and the ones that were just being flat out abused, potentially so drugged up that they just weren't aware. It's all of them coming from poor white backgrounds, pretty much as well. So it's really, really tough. And the McPherson report, which obviously protected the perpetrators to a great degree as well, unfortunately. When it came to health, I'm just going to skim this bit. Because sexual health services really are quite irrelevant. People raping these children were not concerned with contraceptives. Inquiry interviewed the Director of Public Health, who had lengthy experience with both LSCBs and ACPCs. Earlier meetings showed there was a general awareness of sexual abuse rather than sexual exploitation. Sexual abuse was associated with individuals rather than groups. Physical abuse seemed to take a higher priority for health organisations. Awareness of sexual exploitation, especially in relation to the older age group of girls, came much later. It took some time for the girls to be recognised as victims, and the justice system had some way to go in ensuring support and protection. A number of those interviewed, including health professionals, commented on the complexity of the current health structure. There are several health organisations within the NHS, which are represented at the Safeguarding Board and in other major multi-agency forums. Yes, it's a kind of a system of trusts that operate in different areas. It was difficult to establish a single point of contact or a representative who could consult with other parts of the service. But both the Director of Public Health and 2 NHS Rotherham staff thought that local agencies should have provided more consistent, longer-term counselling and other supports. Risky business project. Okay. This is good. The first public service in Rotherham to identify and support young people involved in CSE. Good, I'm glad that there's a section on this so I don't have to hunt out too much further afield. And hopefully it will give some backing for potential interviews later. Risky Business was the first public service to identify and support young people. It operated on an outreach basis. One of the only ones, like everyone else, was like, come to us, whereas they outreached. Worked with large numbers of victims as well as those at risk. The council committed financially to it. It worked effectively with the police on Operation Central, the only one with successful prosecutions, notably. But it was also seen as something of a nuisance, particularly by children's social care, and there were many tensions between the two. Alright, let's get down here and devote a section to Risky Business. Right. Established in 1997, folded into broader CSE team in 2005, wasn't it? Let's see. Yeah. Ran until 2012. Often, oh no, they became part of the joint CSE team. Okay. Seen as a nuisance by Child's Social Services, only organisation to offer outreach services to at-risk and abused children. Right. was a small team of youth workers. Let me see what else we got here, sorry. There were allegations of exaggeration and unprofessional approaches by the project, none of which were substantiated. Management failed to address these problems and to enforce proper joint working and effective coordination so that the most could be made. The Risky Business project was incorporated within Safeguarding from 2011 and became part of the CSE team in 2012. There was a small group of youth workers following concerns by local staff about young people being abused through prostitution. Very useful. There we are. After the project was established, a child sexual exploitation interagency network was developed by voluntary and statutory agencies in 1998. A small survey was distributed by this network and identified 70 young women and 11 young men involved in exploitation, or prostitution as it was then termed. ACPC protocols were drafted, 2 regular meetings were established, which were later merged into a group known as the Key Players. Right. Again, this whole paragraph, dead useful. The Risky Business project aimed to provide support to young people in Rotherham aged between 11 and 25 with 2 main purposes. Offer advice and information regarding sexual health, accommodation, drugs and alcohol, parenting and budgeting, eating disorders, self-harm and abuse, promoting self-esteem and self-assertiveness, and to offer training in sexual exploitation, abuse and related matters to schools, agencies and individuals working with young people. For some years after its foundation, the funding of Risky Business was uncertain, though eventually the council acknowledged its important work and increased its core budget. It adopted an outreach approach. It started where the young person was, concerned as what we call nowadays ethnographically, concerned itself with the whole person and addressed any issues that the young person brought to the relationship, did not prescribe or direct. So let's pop that in there. Its methods were complementary to the statutory services, and its success depended upon the skills of the individual worker and the level of trust which young people committed to it. Its operations were volatile, unpredictable, and considered risky. Nevertheless, it was performing a function which statutory services were not able to replicate. Any semblance of the statutory worker had to be set aside in order to create and retain trust. In a report in 2008 on the protection of young people in Rotherham from sexual exploitation, it was stated that Risky Business continues to be the main service available to young people. It takes in referrals, it undertakes assessments of risk, and directly intervenes to manage and reduce risk by working with young people and other agencies to devise and deliver exit plans. The key role played by Risky Business in the success of Operation Central was recognised by many. The Lessons Learned Independent Review reflected its work was highly thought of by the victims and proposed a greater role for the project. Placed a high value on the training programs which Risky Business provided to schools, and presentations on CSE were derived mainly from the work of Risky Business. Task of dealing with issues between Risky Business and children's social care lay with management. Given the histories of some of the young people who were affected, it is tragic that in so many instances management failed to do this. There were too many examples of young people properly referred by Risky Business to children's social care who somehow fell through the net and were not treated with the priority that they deserved. It was almost as if the source of the referral from Risky Business was a pretext for applying and attaching a lower importance to it. Jealousy, that's what that is. Interviews with managers in post at that time confirm this view. They were regarded as a group of youth workers treading on the territory of the children's social care. Another senior manager disbelieved what Risky Business presented, describing it as almost professional gossip. Tensions manifested in a number of ways, particularly in individual cases. All agreed that relationships were not good between the project and children's social care. Managers of children's social care wished to bring the project firmly into a child protection approach, whilst the project's staff wanted to advocate on behalf of the girls involved and protect their confidentiality. Yes. Nice to see you, Heron's War and Muktak 2. That's good. Children's, I'm not happy to do it, but I'm perfectly willing to do it. When we keep to things like this, I'm quite good at maintaining and being quite detached. When we get into individual case studies, it's very difficult for me, which is why we're kind of skipping away from those at the moment. When it comes to putting together the full documentary, obviously they'll come in and be an invaluable resource, but I think we've read enough of them at the moment, which is really shed light on the issue. Really, I want to get through this report and then away from Rotherham, because I feel like Rotherham has been publicised a lot, and I think that if we focus too much there, we'll lose track of the extent. But Rotherham is obviously going to be the primary case study. Children's social care would complain the referral was not accompanied by detailed information which they required to accept it. Serious criticism of the Risky Business record keeping is referred to elsewhere in this report, in particular for the Child S Serious Case Review. Having read a sample of the Risky Business records, the inquiry did not find these criticisms justified. Where records were available, they were detailed and well kept. And again, I'm just getting the vibe of this, of just pure, unadulterated jealousy. The Risky Business were doing what children's social services could not and did not do. And as such, they're just jealous. They were judged to be equivalent to the standard of many of the contemporaneous children's social care records and children in need. My mic is buzzing again. 1 second. Oh yes, I see it. 1 second. Hopefully that takes care of some of it at least. I really need to get myself a new microphone, but I can't afford one right now. I'm really sorry to everyone who has to suffer through it. Okay. Just let me know if it starts causing trouble again, because it's not ideal. Children's social care would complain the referral was not accompanied by this. Where records were available, they were detailed and well kept. They were judged to be the equivalent to the standard of many of the contemporaneous children's social care records. Child protection and looked after children's files were of a higher standard. Several people interviewed were of the view that the project's success was one of the causes of professional jealousy, funnily that, which led them to being assigned a lesser role in SAR and for children's social staff to take the lead with the individual girls involved. This proved to be a serious misjudgment, because it didn't lead to anything and they failed fucking miserably. Excuse my language. I'm a bit fired up now for all of this stuff. Yes. Breathe, Mark, breathe. Yeah, I updated the sound profile, so hopefully it dealt with the buzzing. It's not the intention of this overview to overstate the achievements of Risky Business. Its staff readily acknowledge that they made mistakes, that their enthusiasm and frustration led them to breaking rules and frequently getting into trouble. There were periods when relationships between Risky Business and statutory agencies were poor, and a less confrontational approach might have strengthened joint working. A senior person from another local voluntary organisation commented that single-issue projects always face the risk of focusing on their own issue to the exclusion of all others. However, for many years Risky Business was the only service to consistently recognise the gravity of CSE in the borough and the severe damage it was causing young people. By its nature, the project style made a bad fit with the structured services involved. Failure of management to understand and resolve the issue was a running flaw in the development of child protection services. Yeah. The project is now incorporated within the joint CSE team. It is doubtful whether its original ethos and style of working survive this absorption into the statutory system, where it is firmly located in a child protection model. The grounds for the move included the belief that risky business lacked managerial and risk assessment skills, the rigour of case management supervision procedures, risk management plans, defined roles and responsibilities, and office systems, all of which fails to recognise the quality of their work with individuals and their distinct, different, professional role, and entirely misses the point. And that's the most important paragraph in this document so far. Right. So there are 3 early reports, but my throat, I'm sorry guys, is absolutely ragged from all of this stuff. I was hoping to do another 11 pages today, but we'll cover that tomorrow. Just want to go through and see what we've got next. So we've got 3 early reports here. We have ethnicity. We have workforce vacancies. Lovely. That's going to be dry as hell. The role of senior members of the council. Yep. And then hopefully recommendations, which we won't go through because recommendations are relative unimportance, and these are all just appendices which are about the practice of the inquiry. But as far as I'm aware, the inquiry itself was pretty good, and lists of people, attendees, and so on. So we actually only have to go through another 40 or so pages tomorrow. Yeah. Let me see. So you go from 89 to 122 tomorrow. So obviously that's 33 pages to do tomorrow. And then we can move on to the what I had hoped to get onto for the rest of today, which was the John Wedger and Sarah Champion stuff. But clearly that will have to wait. Yes. This stuff is both depressing and infuriating. It's not that, man. It's less about my own personal preference and more about the fact that I'm going to lose my voice if I carry on. So, unfortunately, I will have to catch you all tomorrow, probably around the same time. So, anywhere between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'll start because I've got some stuff to do in the morning. But it's been an honour and a privilege to have you guys here with me, supporting the work. Thank you to everyone who was so generous and gave towards the completion of the project and the future of the channel. And we will see you next time. All right. Take care, everyone. Good night.